Thanks for inviting me to be here and talk to you about all this stuff. And of course, my work isn't possible without the work that you do. But when they asked me to, I made sure to tell them I'm not an archivist, which you all know. So, I hope what I have for you is still relevant. Get this plugged in. And I have to give a plug to Jill Titus's book. I know she was at a panel earlier today on Gettysburg, 1963, Civil Rights, Cold War Politics, Historical Memory, America's Most Famous Small Town. She's the one who has dug into the archives about the Confederate monuments and the history of the monuments around the Centennial far more than I have. And her book's going to be out later this month, so I would highly recommend that if this is a subject of interest to you. Okay, so get this going. All right, so we're up. Okay, good. So remember Gettysburg battlefield, and this picture is actually not the battlefield. So if you go up the Warfield Tower, some of you may know it as the Longstreet Tower. It's on West Confederate Ave, just past the four-way stop. And it's been called the Longstreet Tower for decades. I don't know how since it's probably been up. But as Christopher Gwynn, who's the chief interpreter at Gettysburg National Military Park, told me sometime in the last year, he's calling it the Warfield Tower. He said he's on a one-man mission to call it the Warfield Tower. I said I'd join him because James Warfield was the African-American blacksmith who owned the property that the tower sits on, and he, along with people like Abraham Bryan, had to flee when the battle came, when Confederates came near. So if you go up the Warfield Tower and look to the east, you see the field of Pickett's Charge, which is what most visitors do. If you look to the west, this is what you see. And I'll get to the relevance of that as we go through this. So as I'm sure you're all well aware, a lot of the controversy over monuments and the potential removal is that some people fear that removal erases history, or that it's driven by revisionist historians like myself, who are part of what's been labeled cancel culture. And so I hear this kind of stuff often, and my response is threefold. One, it's that it's actually the monuments that have tried to erase or cancel or ignore history, particularly the Confederate state monuments. That's what my main focus is. And two, all history is revisionist, as you probably all know. Some revisions are bad, based on incorrect information, poor research. They haven't gone in the archives. They've been very selective. Narrow selected information, or the silencing or attempt to silence many of the stories. And three, I want more history, not less history. This is how I make a living. Why would I want less history? So I suggest to people another way of thinking about the monument issue. Is a friend of mine who's a communications professor at Penn State, and he lives just around the corner from me. He mentioned to me during July 4th weekend in 2015, this is about 2 weeks after Clementa Pinckney, Tawana Sanders, Cynthia Hurd, Sharonda Singleton, Daniel Simmons, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Susan Jackson, Ethel Lance, and Myra Thompson. Anybody know those names? Those are the names of the Charleston Nine who were assassinated in Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston in June of 2015. And so we were talking because what we saw in Gettysburg, and as you may remember, a lot of places started to pull Confederate flags and Confederate memorabilia from their stores. Walmart did. The Gettysburg National Military Park pulled Confederate flags and memorabilia from their store unless it was directly relevant to the battle. Like if it was a book about the Confederacy, it had a Confederate flag on it. Otherwise, if it was a teddy bear with a Confederate flag, they no longer sold it, and I don't believe sell it anymore. And so in response to that, as you may recall, there was actually an increase in sales of Confederate memorabilia. So what I saw on Saturday, July 4th, when I was driving through Gettysburg Square in the morning, was this picture that I took outside. I was driving with a friend from New Hampshire, so I took it outside the van window as we drove through on a rainy morning. Was a group of about 10 people or so with Confederate flags in the square. And one of them was a teenager, a variety of people. There were more than you can see in the picture here. So this was their response to what happened in Charleston just 2 weeks prior. And then in my block where I live in the borough in Gettysburg near the post office. And so on my block on July 4th weekend, there was, as you drive down Route 30, somebody put a Confederate battle flag out over Route 30. And then a neighbor around the corner, as you might be able to see here, had an American flag, a "Don't Tread on Me" Confederate battle flag, and actually a Union Jack, the rectangular one. And actually, they used to have a Confederate national flag, and they took it down after Charles Snyder was assassinated. And I thought, oh, they've had a rethink. And then about a week later, out came the Confederate battle flags. I thought, no, they doubled down. Unfortunately, I was curious. I wanted to talk to them about that, but they moved shortly afterwards. And then just down the alley from me was a house that put out the Confederate, I think this is the third Confederate national flag. Correct me if I'm wrong. A Confederate Union Jack and an American flag. So Confederate flags proliferated, and as my friend who's communications prof, we were standing on the sidewalk talking about this, and he mentioned that Confederate flags and monuments are a form of discourse, and in 2015 it was currently all one way, because nobody was speaking back. And in many ways what he's describing is semiotics, which are defined thusly, and communications people, this is kind of what they do, is delve into semiotics. And so thinking about what this stands for, and what the Confederate monument stands for, and what they don't stand for, and what kind of stories they obscure, it began to interest me more about what stories are told, whose stories are told, how they are told, where they are told, and what stories don't get told specifically on the battlefield at Gettysburg. Because obviously we can't control a lot of what goes on in other places, but the battlefield at Gettysburg is a federal park, we have some influence. We can exert some influence on what gets told and what doesn't get told there. And one of the ways we do that is we do what you all do, or what you bless us with, is we go into the archives. So I started doing some research at Gettysburg National Military Park Library, special collections at Gettysburg College, a couple other places, and of course, we know many of the archives nowadays are online. In fact, one of the sources I'll refer to later did not used to be digitized, but is now. So when we go into those archives, the stories are the voices that have often been ignored, and I would say not silenced, because they've already spoken. We just aren't hearing them. And as sometimes I get this when students say, and you'll hear historians do this, academics and others say, well, we want to give voice to people. I say, we don't give them their voice. They have a voice. The issue is, are we hearing their voice? Right? We're not giving anybody anything. Do we permit ourselves to be vehicles for retelling those stories? And Africans and African Americans, their oral traditions and oral culture, in our tradition of black oral culture, that story has been translated and retold and transmitted in a variety of ways that often escape certain kinds of archives and that in Western society that we rely on print archives. And there's that kind of archive, that kind of oral archive does exist in Gettysburg. It exists in the Gettysburg black communities and some of the black families who trace their history back before the Civil War. There's a movement here in Gettysburg by some of those folks and others to start a Gettysburg Black History Museum. Well, that's the name of it, the Gettysburg Black History Museum. You can donate to it. I don't get anything from that, so I just help when they if they need it, but I'm not salaried or anything like that. So, and they're working together with the Adams County Historical Society as well. And they want to tell their own stories of both the Civil War era and the century and a half after through that museum. And it'd be fantastic if one day this organization had some members of the Gettysburg Black History Museum, hopefully if it started in a few years, have them come and tell their stories about the kind of archives they use that have been here in the Gettysburg black community for 150, 200 years. So their stories are much more than about just the Civil War and the battlefield. They include all of that. They include stories like the black sniper on Culp's Hill that was likely a member of Gettysburg's black community. Some people think he was Randall Johnston, who wanted to start a black militia, and the unions told him no. And The story goes he picked up the rifle of a dead soldier in Culp's Hill and started shooting at Confederate soldiers and disappeared. We have eyewitness testimony of this black man who did that. Nobody knows who he was, so it's just some guesses. Those are the kind of stories that get ignored, the voices we don't hear, what Haitian historian Michel Rotreo called the silences of the past. And the monuments on the battlefield, I think they help ignore and sometimes try to erase those stories. They tell a lot of good stories. Some of those stories are well-grounded in research, some not so much. But the work that you all do, I mean, part of it, and this isn't, I'm not just pandering to the crowd. Maybe I am pandering to the crowd a little bit. But I can't do my job without what you do, right? And I firmly believe it's vital because, like I said, these people have spoken, and the way we hear them is by preserving what they have said, and then we just need to retell that. So I'm going to focus, the archives ultimately don't let them be silenced, right, if we listen. So I'm going to focus on 3 examples of how monuments are trying to silence some of those stories. So the first is these stories of black freedom. So the first is the Virginia State Monument. So this is Gettysburg National Military Park. This is a picture I took July 4th of 2020. And this was dedicated, it says, in 1917. And so this past summer, I was riding my bike down West Confederate Ave. And I didn't know this was going on. I just come back from a 1-week tour of museums in the South. And so I was riding my bike, and there's this huge crowd at the Virginia State Monument. And one of the people I happened to see there is the superintendent of Gettysburg National Military Park. He was, as he said, incognito in civilian clothes, so nobody knew who he was. And I said, so hey, what's going on here? And he said, well, it's the Picket Charge Walk, led by a battlefield guide that people know well. And they said there was 300 people there. I'm sure there was more than that. It was a lot. And so I thought, well, I like to learn, so I'm going to go. I've never done this. It's free, so I joined the crowd. And it's on, I think it's on C-SPAN, or there's some video of it. Fascinating stories that I heard from the battlefield, the park ranger, not a battlefield guide, the NPS ranger. And so how many have seen the movie Gettysburg? Okay, a lot of you. I've never seen it. I've tried, keep falling asleep, sorry. But Stephen Lang, who I did not know, was there. He came out and did a little talk for a little bit. They took questions. I raised my hand, but they didn't pick me. I was wearing my black and proud shirt. I don't know if that's why, because everybody else there was white. But I wanted to ask, what's it like to portray someone who fought to keep 4 million people enslaved? But I don't know how that question would have been received by the crowd. But it was fascinating. So it was fascinating. And one of the stories that was told was of 28th Virginia Infantry Regiment Captain Michael Spessard, who was a farmer from Newcastle. And as you can see in the monument, those who've been there, the front of the monument are 7 men, and they're supposed to portray kind of the spectrum of white Confederate soldiers, farmers, businessmen, merchants. And it's that's a reality. And most of them weren't slave owners. So there's a certain story that's being communicated there, certain semiotics that are being communicated. And so the NPS ranger told the story of Spessard and his son Hezekiah, who is also in the 28th Infantry, and Hezekiah died in Pickett's charge. And the NPS ranger told this story really well, and part of his point was they were people just like us. He wanted us to be empathetic, which I completely agree with. And the tragedy of war, that this man lost his son, and there was a Union soldier and son on the other side, same thing happened. And so it's these horrific stories, this human tragedy, which should not be ignored, regardless of what they were fighting for. I think it's important that we tell those stories as well. Now, whether we agree or not with what they were fighting for, my father served 3 tours in Vietnam. I don't think that was a good war for the U.S. to be in. But I think my father's story matters, and I think his story should be told. So I get that. But what wasn't told in that story on the battlefield that was connecting us with these white men who fought for the Confederacy was Spessard was a slave owner, and his father was a slave owner. And Hezekiah probably wasn't a slave owner because he was only like 18 or 19, but he grew up in a slave-owning family. And there's a pretty good chance that some of the Spessards understood what this war was about. So that was entirely absent from the 4-hour Pickett's Charge walk. And I wonder why is that absent. Spessard wrote in 1862 that the South was fighting against an enemy that would invade our home, confiscate our property. He probably understood that property included human beings. So let's tell that story too. We can also tell the story of the dedication. When the U.S. Assistant Secretary of War, his speech, which you can find in the Gettysburg National Military Park Library, this is just the first page of it, when he described Reconstruction as the rank breath of Reconstruction. Instead of slavery, the white man by his works has said to the black man at his back, brought to me by others as you have been, it is my part to afford the discipline which of yourselves you have been unable to acquire. The universe abandons you. I will protect and direct. Southern slavery will hold up the noblest mutilation of an inferior race. Southern master gave to the Southern slave more than the slave gave to the master. And the slave realized it. I think those black men, women, and children probably realized something else than what the Secretary of War in 1917 thought they did. Let's tell the story of the 1987 rededication in that context, where Robert E. Lee is described, who sits atop the 41-foot concrete podium there. Robert Lee Lee was described in 87 by the National Park Service, that wasn't the superintendent, can't remember what his official title was, as one man who by majesty of character, the perfection of his manhood, the glory of his genius, represents and embodies all that Virginia and her sister southern states can or need vouchsafe to the country and to the world as a supreme example of their convictions and principles. One of Lee's principles, and again, this isn't about saying Lee was just a horrible, horrible person. I mean, maybe he was, but he probably had a lot of good qualities too. People are complicated. One of Lee's principles was he was committed to slave owning. His wife owned 189 slaves. His father-in-law stipulated that those slaves would be freed in 1862 in September. Lee petitioned the Virginia legislature twice to keep those slaves longer than the will permitted. Lee was described by one of his enslaved men as one of the meanest men he had ever met. So depending on your perspective, Lee is what was described in the 1980 rededication or something very different. So let's tell those stories. What was the perspective of the people that Lee owned, de facto owned through his wife? And then, of course, we have the Mississippi State Monument, dedicated in 1973. Started planning in the 1960s. If you've driven by it, it's dramatic. The Confederate state monuments, they got the best sculptures, I think, on the battlefield. Like Louisiana is beautiful. This one is striking. I mean, the action it conveys. I coach high school soccer at Gettysburg. Took some of my soccer players there once, and they noticed something about that statue I'd never thought before. They look at the thighs of that guy. I bet he could strike a ball. So it's a little bit of glorification there. All monuments do that, right? It's part of semiotics. Union, Confederate, World War II, whatever, all monuments glorify and sanitize. Because the reality is Confederate soldiers, like Union soldiers, they walked a lot. They probably had very wiry, muscly thighs, but they probably weren't bulging like this guy's thighs. But the Mississippi State Monument, the inscription on the base includes this phrase, if you can read that they fought for our brave sires fought for their righteous cause. And so it has no context or explanation or competing monuments. By the way, I want to make sure, so this isn't a diatribe against the National Park Service. Well, maybe the National Park Service of the past. National Park Service of today, at least at Gettysburg National Military Park, they very much want all of these stories to be told more fully and are trying to move in that direction. So for me, this is all about helping them do that. But the National Park Service, currently this monument has no context or explanation or competing narratives or semiotics or stories alongside it. And that's even though at the time it was actually challenged, this inscription, not the monument. So some of you may know how this works. The National Park Service approves, right? Congress approves whether a monument can be put on the battlefield or removed. Right? It literally takes an act of Congress. Once it's approved, the National Park Service has some say, and if some of you are, know the details better than me, correct me. They have some involvement with what goes on, like the inscription, but the design and stuff like that, it's a different process. So when the inscription is submitted to the National Park Service, the superintendent at the time, George Emery, whose letter is in the Gettysburg National Military Park Library, and a lot of this has been digitized over the last year or so as well. He writes back, and you probably can't read that there. Ignore the pink stuff. That's just my notes on there. He is keenly aware that this inscription is problematic. And so he suggests different language, because he's basically saying you can't say the righteous cause, because that's an opinion. And it's a debatable opinion. So he says you need to remove that. You can say they fought for the cause they believed in, or whatever it may be. Emery was probably aware that the Mississippi Declaration of Secession states it is but just we should declare the prominent reasons which have induced our course. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. There was no choice left to us but submission to the mandates of abolition or dissolution of the Union. So if the Mississippi Declaration of Secession in 1861 and the Mississippi and other things that Mississippi and other Southern leaders said at the time, if they're going to be in sync, then we would have to understand that righteous cause as protecting the enslavement of 4 million, almost 4 million black women and children, to the great profit of many white Southerners and to no profit of themselves. And political profit, economic profit, social profit in all kinds of ways. So the committee from Mississippi writes back, and all these letters are at the library. Fascinating to read them, for me anyway. And so they write back and they say, well, how can you say that? It was a righteous cause. They get Tom Brady, who is a state Supreme Court justice in Mississippi. And Brady had previously written a very pointed rebuttal to Brown v. Board, and he's got a pamphlet, I think it's called Black Monday. Jill Titus knows this stuff better than I do. And it's a pretty racist pamphlet. Like, we read it today, there's no way this guy, anybody would tolerate him being a judge. And so they get Tom Brady in 1970 to write back to George Emery, and among the other things he says in his letter to Emery, he says, the South has had the most to forgive in this matter, and the South has forgiven. So Brady is saying to Emery, you Northerners, you've done us wrong for far too long. So, and this cause was righteous, and it's the cause they believed in. So part of what happens is Emery leaves Gettysburg as superintendent. Don't know why, haven't been able to find that out. It was perhaps just the regular rotation. I don't know, it's because of this issue. He's replaced by a guy named Jerry Stroger, who's a white man from Mississippi. And this is the result, is that inscription, right? That's the result. So he approves it quickly. So now this monument is telling people they fought for the righteous cause without telling what the righteous cause was. And then my favorite is the South Carolina monument. So it's installed, dedicated July 2nd, 1963, and that's a centennial, 100 years later. What else is going on in 1963?
Centennial.
Yeah, the centennial. I mean, in America in general. Civil rights movement, okay, specifically 63, any? March on Washington, what's the whole name for that anyway, by the way? Yeah, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, right? That's what MLK called it, and this SCLC. So that's a month and a half after this. And part of what generates the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom is what had happened in the spring, right? In Birmingham, where King and the SCLC, and that's when he writes a letter from a Birmingham jail. They go to Birmingham, Bull Connor, the dogs being sicked on the Children's Crusade, the Children's March, dogs being sicked on fire hoses, because they know this is going to generate a lot of national tension, and indeed it does. That's when the majority of white Americans, for the first time, a small majority, start to support King and the Civil Rights Movement, right? Because they see these images in newspapers, on TV, and they're horrified. which they knew. King and SCLC, that's what they wanted, right? It was a very strategic plan because they knew Bull Connor was a vociferous racist. And so this is Alabama, and what does George Wallace do? George Wallace, the governor, he fights back. In May of '63 is when you have George Wallace standing in the doors of the University of Alabama saying there's no way they're going to let these black students in. James Hood and Vivian Malone, right, the two black students who are trying to integrate. And on the South Carolina monument, the inscription, and I'll connect this relevance in a moment, the inscription tells a different story. But before we get to that, so I'm going to break a rule. So I know you're not supposed to put a lot of text on PowerPoint, as I always tell my students, right? But just bear with me, okay? So going back to the history, Declaration, this is what the official title, also online, easily available. And this is just some excerpts from the Declaration of Secession of South Carolina. First state to secede, arguably the most politically and economically powerful. Probably, I mean, Virginia, I think probably you could make a good case that was more powerful in many ways, but South Carolina certainly a close second, if not equally as economically and politically powerful. So there's this long preamble, and in the preamble of the Declaration, they talk about the law of compact between the states that was key to the founding of the country. And they say this law of compact has been broken. And the reason it's been broken, and this is the only reason they identify in the Declaration of Secession, the only key constitutional reason they identify, is the fourth article. Okay, so historians, I don't know about you archivists, but historians, we call this the first Fugitive Slave Law. Right? It's in the Constitution. And so South Carolina is saying the law of compact is being broken because of the Fugitive Slave Law. And they said this particular stipulation, which is just a small part of the Constitution, they're saying without this, we would have never come into the Union. We would have never joined the United States. And I don't know that that's true, but that's how they're understanding it in 1860. And they go on, talk about the increasing hostility of the non-slaveholding states, that they're not fulfilling the law of compact. This particular law of this particular part of it, right? Because then they list all the states. In many of these states, the fugitives discharged from service or labor claimed. None of them has the state government complied with the stipulation made in the Constitution. Okay, and so, as I said, all history is revision. It's all interpretation. So this is my interpretation, although so I don't publish a lot in academic journals. I do some. So I published some of this. So it's been reviewed by peers, and there's been other people who publish a lot more than me who have written similar things over the last few decades. And I don't know if we are going to do Q&A, but if we do, I can tell you how I got dragged into some of this later. But so South Carolina basically says, since you northern states are not fulfilling the Fugitive Slave Law, we're out. We're done. We're leaving the Union. And that last line, the northern states, have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and these who remain have been excited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. So this is my interpretation, but I would argue interpretation that's backed up by sources and research and other historians, is essentially what South Carolina is saying in 1860 is, we want you, the federal government, to exercise more power because those northern states are exercising their rights in defiance of the federal government. States like Pennsylvania and the personal liberty law in the 1830s, which eventually does get contravened, their liberty law says if escaping slaves, and I don't call them fugitive slaves because they're trying to escape permanently. So escaping slaves, if they come into Pennsylvania, slave catchers can come in and pursue them. They can't stop them from doing that because it's constitutional, but we ain't going to help you. And in fact, we're going to tell our law enforcement officials they are not allowed to help you. And then the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act makes that more difficult and causes a lot of other issues you don't have time to get into right now. But South Carolina, this is what's eating at them. Now here's the thing is the number of slaves who escaped successfully to the north, and by successfully I mean they made it. That didn't mean they didn't get caught and returned, but they at least made it into northern states, is a small number of all 4 million slaves. Well, the millions more before that. It's a tiny percentage. So why is South Carolina getting so upset about this small number? It's because they fear that it's just one part of the foundation that's going to crumble, that's going to protect the institution. The leaders, when I say South Carolina, I mean, I'm talking about a state. I'm talking about the leaders, right? The elite slaveholders. It's a whole different story when you get down to what does the average person in the street believe. Some of them, absolutely, they're in this. Some of them, they don't care. They're just living their lives. Well, I shouldn't say they don't care. They're not as invested. There's a whole spectrum. But for the elite, the people who are leading this, this is what they are keenly aware of. So since those northern states are too rebellious, South Carolina is leaving the United States. And here's, how did I get there? Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. Oh yeah, so I got to get to Wallace, okay. So, let me come back to here. And I don't know if you can read the inscription there, just in case you can't. So it says that men of honor might forever know the responsibilities of freedom, dedicated South Carolinians stood and were counted for their service and convictions, abiding faith in the sacredness of states' rights, provided their creed. Here many earned eternal glory. Okay, so it's all about states' rights in 1963. And this monument, I would argue, perverts the truth, ignore the voices of the people that we can find. We can find them in the archives. It lies every day to hundreds, even thousands of visitors, because those lies hide how black women, men, and children moved the United States to be better. And part of what I'm struck by, because I keep finding these stories of black women who are a minority among runaways, but I wonder sometimes if they just drive Southern slaveholders even more crazy that they're escaping for a variety of reasons. And we've got this long history of black women in America having a disproportionate impact, African Americans in general, but black women even more so in particular. Recommend to you Martha Jones's great book, Vanguard, of black women who have this outsized impact on the country, like Stacey Abrams, or Opal Tometi and Elise Garza and Patrice Cullors, the founders of Black Lives Matter. Now, whether you agree with their politics or not, they've had a huge impact on the country. And likewise with people that we often don't hear about, right? Those voices who have spoken, the people who have spoken, we don't hear them. So one of those is Hester. Hester is a black woman who lives in Hagerstown, Maryland. She's enslaved, and she runs away in 1847. And she follows the mountains, South Mountain, so that first picture that I put up, that's South Mountain Range. She follows South Mountain, which W. Du Bois said goes all the way into Tennessee. He called it the Great Black Way because there's all these majority black counties, especially in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. And so she follows those mountains, and we know that escaping slaves often used geographical conduits, right? They didn't have Siri or GPS or anything like that. So they're following rivers and mountains and valleys because they know north. You probably heard, you know the kids' book, right? Follow the Drinking Gourd, things like that. And so Hester makes her way to Carlisle, and she gets caught by slave catchers and the slave owner. And so she's held in prison, and the black community in Carlisle finds out about this. And so there's Hester goes to the judge. The judge is going to have a hearing where the slave catcher and the owner can say, yeah, she belongs to us, and we need to take her back. And the judge basically validates their statement. So the black community, the black Carolinians are not allowed in the courtroom, so they're waiting outside, and they time their strategy well. So they wait until Hester is being brought out of the courtroom to be returned to slavery, and before she gets in the carriage, they pounce, and they tear her away from the slave owners and the deputy, or slave catchers and the owner and the deputy, and a few of them take off down the street with Hester. And the slave catchers and the owner pursue, and then there's a larger crowd of about 30 black Carolinians and a couple of white allies who are pursuing the pursuers. And they're picking up anything they can to throw at the slave catchers and the slave owner. Bricks, 5 minutes, yeah, bricks, anything they can to do that, and they hit the slave owner in the head, He dies a few weeks later from his injuries. There's a trial of the 28 black people who were chasing them and the one white defendant. And at that trial, the prosecutor says, if you don't find them guilty and send a message to the South that we're with them on returning fugitive slaves, a glare of the Civil War will light up the land. And Hester does escape. Don't know what happened to her. She disappears. So behind these mountains of the South Carolina Monument, we know the whole story, right? You can see the mountains right there. If you stand on West Confederate Ave and look at that monument where it says it's about states' rights, we can see the story behind it. That actually the mountains behind us tell us that black people, because they're escaping, are forcing South Carolina to say the problem is the federal government isn't exercising enough power over the rights of the northern states. And this monument tells the exact opposite, right? It flips the truth on its head. And in 1963, at the dedication, George Wallace, who's from Alabama, a month after he stood in the university doors, gives a dedication day speech, and he says, the South will continue to fight for its constitutional and individual rights. Everybody knew exactly what he was talking about. Part of why they knew what he was talking about, because there had been a reverend from Notre Dame who had given a speech about civil rights the 2 days before. Ike had given a speech at the Gettysburg football stadium, where we play soccer now and football, that did not mention civil rights, but did mention how people needed to depend on themselves and their local government. And when Wallace, Chief Segregationist #1, says this, he gets a standing ovation, because everybody knew what he was talking about. And so we have this monument today on the battlefield that tells a story that's a bad version of revisionist history. When we know that if we go to the sources, we can find a fuller story, and we can tell that story better. And what I hope to see someday is not just a sign. I mean, a sign would be great that tells this story, but a sign's not going to compete with a monument, is we get different kind of monuments that communicate a different form of semiotics, that tell a fuller story, and we know it's a fuller story, a better story, that tells, that unsilences, or not silences, that listens to these voices that are buried in the archives, and tells a story about American freedom. So when people go on West Confederate Ave, they're looking at Pickett's Charge, they're doing the Pickett's Charge walk, but they're also looking to the West, and they're hearing about these people that are the reason why we have a Pickett's Charge in the first place. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm all done.